get called autistic for being overly rational. So let's assume that this is going to be the most persuasive argument to someone like me. Then, for the sake of can you maybe give me the rendition that you hold to as far as the tag argument goes, the one that, as Jay Dyer presents it, what do you think are his premises and conclusion?
Well, I think what tag basically is a paradigm comparison. It's about telling you, okay, you, as a human being, you have to, as long as you're being rational, and every man has to be rational, even if they rationally choose to be irrational. It's about which worldview do you want to choose as a rational human being. And when you compare different worldviews, the one that's most, most justified and most coherent is the Orthodox Christian worldview. That's what the argument basically sets out to do.
Okay, and so what's the methodology by which we're going to establish that the Orthodox Christian view is going to have these two conditions being the most justified? And you said something else in there, so it's the most justified and something else. What was the other one? Sorry.
Coherent. So
coherent.
It's about giving the most fundamental level of justification, and also about being coherent.
Okay, so what's the methodology? How do we establish that the Orthodox Christian view has these two qualities?
And also possibly Occam's razor, the most simple. But that's another thing I'm not too familiar with. But yeah, let's just stick to
the most So you think it has three qualities: it's justified, it's coherent, and it's the most parsimonious of any view?
I don't think tag is the most parsimonious. I think believing in the Orthodox God, or in God, or in general theism, I think would be more parsimonious than believing in other things. Let's just put that on the side.
Well, okay. Well, then let's just talk about the two things that you think are the most persuasive. So you've got justification, and then you've got coherence. So, and you said the way that it established this is by a worldview analysis. Now, I'm not an expert on Jay Dyer's view, but if I remember correctly, he probably holds to the school of thought that basically you can't step outside of your own worldview, right? So you can't what we can't do is I can't step outside of my worldview in order to analyze two other worldviews, right? There's not there's not like this neutral space I can step into. There's going to be some set of assumptions that I have. So in principle, how do we analyze two different worldviews without utilizing a third worldview? How do we go about doing that? What's the methodology, do you think?
Do we analyze a second worldview without say that again?
So if we've got two worldviews, right, on the table that we're working with, you've got the Eastern Orthodox view, or the Orthodox Christian view, however you want to phrase it. And then we have, on the other side of the line that we're analyzing, we've got some sort of atheistic view. But we want to analyze these two views to see which one is the more rationally justified, or which one's going to be more coherent. Where do we step to so that we can have that discussion? Where do we step out to be able to do this analysis? Where are we going to stand at when we're doing the analysis?
You don't step out anyway. You stand within the worldview itself and analyze it based on its own standard.
Okay, so you're going to analyze any worldview based on its own standards, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So is coherence a standard of the Orthodox Christian worldview?
Yeah.
Okay, and is justification a standard of the Orthodox Christian worldview?
To a certain extent, yeah.
Okay, so what does it mean? What are the necessary criteria for a worldview to be justified by the Orthodox Christian standard? What's the necessary and sufficient conditions for a worldview to be considered justified?
Orthodoxy doesn't. It's a difficult question, but I don't think the Orthodox person subject puts out a standard for how much you have to justify. How much you have to justify something to believe in it. I think, based on what you require for your daily life, like for example, if you use logic, if you use language, if you use all these things, then you need a justification for them. It's not asking you to give an absolute, omniscient justification for every single thing. Like I don't
Well,
need to know every.
let's start with justifying logic. How does the Orthodox Christian worldview justify logic? What's the justification?
So before I answer this, are you doing an internal critique now? Is that what you're attempting to do? Are you
Well,
still
I'm just
asking this?
trying. Well, I was actually my initial what I was going to set out to do was to establish that essentially you're going to run into like basically a criterion problem, right? So you have to set a standard for what it means to have justification, and then you have to have a standard that you set for the criteria that is coherence, right? So those two standards, once you set those standards, the problem is those standards are going to be internal to any view that you have, right? So like, for instance, if the what it means to be justified is going to be like, say, for instance, it stands atop an axiom. This might be a position that some specific worldview holds. But that's the standard of that worldview on what it views to be justification.
I
Once it
understand.
gets to that point, right? So if your view is going to be that the other worldview doesn't stand up to the justification method of your worldview, then you're not doing
Uh,
an internal critique at all, right? Like you're doing
let
an
me
external.
let me let me let me let me go back. I understand what you're saying. So there isn't a standard of justification in that sense. The standard is if you have a belief, let's say I believe in logic, it's fine if you don't want to justify it, but then you would believe in arbitrariness. And if you believe in arbitrariness, then you can't ask someone else to justify their belief. So you have to, if you allow arbitrariness for yourself, you have to allow it for someone else, basically.
Well,
So it's not about,
I don't see why anybody would be like committed to that, right? Like there's no reason. But it's sort of missing the point. The point is that what you're doing is you're saying here's the standard from my view, and in my view, if I hold this, I'm gonna have to hold it for every other
I'm
view.
not saying that. And you can choose whatever standard you want within your worldview, and then based on that standard, I will tell you, okay, if that's your standard, then I can have applying this standard to my worldview. What I'm doing is fine. Okay, so for example, if you
Okay,
have
so you have
arbitrary belief,
this. So you have this criteria of universality, right? So from your view at least, you're thinking that if I have like arbitrariness with respect to one thing, or if I have, this, it counts as justification in my worldview, then it has to count for justification for other worldviews. Okay. So let's leave that part of the conversation for a second because you mentioned something that I found interesting. Let's talk about justifying logic. How do you go about justifying logic really quickly for me, if you could?
well, first of all, I believe that there is uncreated logic. So logic is not something that, what didn't exist and then existed, something that was always there. And
Mm-hmm.
and the logic that we use is a real thing that exists, and it's similar to this uncreated logic, so it maps onto it. So basically, it's about being able to. So based on that, I can say that reality does match onto logical categories. It's not just something I made up in my head, with no bearing on reality, or with no, ability to trust that has any bearing on reality. And I believe that I have the ability to use logic because I was made in the image of this uncreated being that has uncreated logic. So, I can, it's better to start from you. How would you justify using logic, in this discussion, for example?
Funny enough, I think it's a category error to even think that you can. so, so think about like, okay, if we're talking about like a system of justification, and what do we mean by justification is going to be some other objects or facts that are reason giving for the belief of something, right? So that's usually what I mean when I say justifying something. So and usually this is going to take some inferential methodology, right? So like fact one and fact two are reason giving collectively to believe in fact three, where fact three is logic. Now the problem is that any fact one and fact two you fill into this sort of inferential relationship is going to use logic, right? It's going to any inferential relationship is going to use some notion of logic, whether it's Aristotelian or not. It's going to use some
But
kind of notion of logic. So when it comes
okay,
to justifying logic, I'm curious, one, what does justification mean? And two, how can you do that without it being circular? Like, and if you do it circularly, I don't even know if it's why it would even count as a justification.
Okay, so it's not, circularity is fine to a certain extent, or at least by my worldview. So if you want to do an internal critique, that's what you have to use. If you want to
Okay,
do an
so
external critique,
let's remember that though, because you said you have a view of universality, right? So if it's okay for your view to be circular, it's okay for every other view to be circular, right? So that's one of the criterion from your view. So if, say, for instance, you went into a worldview that is
that's fine.
circular, let's say, for instance,
Yeah,
let's say that worldview says something like, I justify reason based on reason, right? So like logic is only justified by logic. Like this wouldn't be something you could object to in principle if you hold to the principle of universality, where if circularity is okay for you, it's got to be okay for everyone else from your view. That's your personal view.
yeah. No, but it depends circularity at which level. So I'm not saying logic justifies logic. I'm giving you reason why to believe in logic. I'm giving logic a cause and a way that we can use it as subjects and so on and so on. I'm giving reasons why we can rely on logic, and that's what I mean by justifying our ability to use logic.
Well, keep in
Justifying it.
mind, giving reasons, when you give reasons for something, you're using logic. So you're using the thing in question, right? So like when you
No, but
use
that's
something
fine.
that's going
I
to
don't
be
think
in your
that's
conclusion, like you can put anything in there, in anything. I could put universe farting unicorns as the reason to believe in logic, and that's going to be using a reason, right? So reasons are going to be constitutive of logic. So you're going to be using logic to justify logic, no matter what way you do this. It's like it's inescapable. There's not a way to provide something that's reason giving that's not like logical, right? It's just not possible. So you're using the thing that's in question to justify that thing. So that's
I
that's a
think
type
you're
of
drawing.
circularity.
No, I think you're drawing a false equivalence. I don't think. I'm not justifying logic. I'm not saying. I'm not justifying logic with logic. I'm using logic to give you a reason for why logic makes sense, or why we can use it, and so on and so on.
Say that again, but more slowly, really quickly, just so we can get that on recording. Because that I don't know if you understood that you just said the thing that I just critiqued.
I mean, it is getting a bit more, like it's like I said, I'm not well versed in complex philosophical terminology, but
Well, this
as I
one's not really
understand,
that. So
as I understand,
imagine.
circularity is fine to a certain extent. I mean, you can't have a worldview without foundationalism or circularity, unless you can, tell me how that would work.
Well, I don't. The thing is I don't actually think that circularity even here makes any sense. Like I think the reason that you're running into circularity is because there's probably some issues with the way you're thinking about this. But let's just focus on the fact that one, you're fine with circularity. Circularity is apparently okay. And it might depend at what
Yeah, but
level of
you're saying this,
conversation.
but
So
circularity is different in, at different levels. So you keep, so like I said, I'm not well versed in philosophy to explain, the difference at each level, but you
well,
know,
I'll explain it very very quickly and very. So
and
there's a few
I
different
never
theories.
agreed, I never agreed to have this conversation recorded. I was just having an informal chat with you, so I don't know why you're recording this, as a formal debate. I
Um,
told you
um, that wasn't I didn't set this up, so I thought that you discussed that with Marco if you'd already discussed it. You're welcome
you
to
never told me what you.
Marco records almost everything. Yeah.
No, I don't care, but I feel like this guy is trying to, corner me and, use some terminology or whatever that I'm not, like I said, I'm not very familiar with these terms. If you want to have a layman type of conversation, using layman terms, and I'll explain, what I think about the argument. And, it's a very informal discussion. It's not, a formal debate. So I don't know what you're doing, but
Well,
you can talk.
if we run into any sort of like terminology that you're unfamiliar with, or if I use anything you're unfamiliar with, feel free to like
I'm
stop
saying
me and just say, "Hey, I don't know what that means," and I'll like flesh it out for you because I'm not. Look, I'm not going to
I
try to
don't
sit
think
here and like.
because I can't trust that you're gonna, have the right. Like as as I just said, I don't think circularity is the same at on every level.
Well, yeah, but do you even know what it means to have circularity at different levels? Like, because if presumably you think that circularity is different at different levels, then you understand what the different levels were. I
For
was just
example,
going to
if
explain what the different levels
if I
were.
say if so, you're telling me if I say, I'm right because I said I'm right. That's the same as saying logic makes sense because it has a cause and there is a way to trust our ability to use it, and it maps onto it. You're saying that's the same thing?
Yes, so
Obviously,
those two circles are identical. The type of circles
they're not
usually like
identical.
philosophers don't object to are going to be something like, so coherentists, who are the ones who accept some types of circularity, they hold to like paradigmatic circularity. So what paradigmatic circularity means, like, imagine if you have like every node of knowledge, every piece of knowledge you could potentially come up with, right? Like all of them that you know, everything you know is sort of mapped out in front of you, and you have these lines connected to each one of them, and it's like and those lines are these inferential relationships between every possible node of knowledge that you have, and you sort of zoom out on this. That as you zoom out and you look at this, that if it looks like a giant circle as you zoom for the furthest out that you could, that's the kind of circularity that a coherentist is going to hold as a rational circularity, because you're providing all the potential reasons that you could potentially give for that, or all the justifications you could give for that one position, right? So as you
Well,
zoom out and you look at it from
I'm
the
not
further,
rationalizing. I'm not rationalizing why. How could logic make sense? And coming up, I'm grounding this in revelation. So I'm using revealed doctrine, and I'm just putting it out for you.
well, what kind
So
of what notion of grounding are you using? What's the sort of definition you're using for grounding there?
the highest authority of justification is revelation. Is not uh, my rational analysis or whatever.
Well, what I'm asking is like, so usually there's like two major schools of grounding. The first one is like this was called the unionist school. So unionists think that what it means for something to be grounded is there's going to be like an explanatory relationship. So the final point of explanation is the thing that the unionists will hold as the grounding. And then you have the determinist school, which they think essentially, or sorry, the separatist school, which they think like there's a determined type of grounding. Like, for instance, like the componential relationship of like the brittleness of a lamp. So a lamp is brittle in virtue of the fact that it's something about the components of the lamp. So the components of the lamp being in a certain relationship to each other grounds the fact that the lamp is brittle. Those are like the two notions of grounding, right? Now,
Okay,
if
so
you hold to,
I'm unfamiliar with these schools, and I'm just gonna have to tell you this. I do think I think it might be the first one. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not well
okay,
versed in formal philosophy.
okay, well, I mean, if you're going to talk about grounding relations, that's, I would assume that you at least know what grounding you're using, right? Like if that's the,
But
so
I
anyways, that's
can understand,
probably,
as a layman, I can understand that this thing called revelation is justifying this belief. A it's not rationality justifying the belief. It's a revelation. That's as far. I could read into these two schools and I could tell you which one it is, but I'm not. Again, I'm not just gonna say random stuff that would
that's fine.
implicate
I
me.
mean, okay, like, all right, well, let's just focus on the first one then. So revelation is grounding what though? What exactly is revelation grounding? So, because like what you're saying here is if you use either one of these schools, it's going to be like revelation is explaining something, right? So, like what is the thing that you're saying revelation is explaining?
A revelation is given us a worldview that uh, gives us the ability to use transcendental categories to know them, and explains to us how we know these categories and how we can make use of them.
And what kind of transcendental categories are what are the transcendental categories?
Logic, for example.
Wait, so you think revelation is explaining logic, essentially?
It's given us the ability to understand how we know logic and why we can use it.
Okay, so
And,
revelation is giving you the ability
and
to
it's telling
explain
us, sorry,
logic.
and it's telling us what logic is like. That it is a real thing, and that it's caused by this eternal being and so on and so on. So it's given us what logic is, how we can know it, and why we can use it.
What logic is, how we can know it, how we can use it. So you think like so essentially you think that like someone is revealing logic to you. So is this being done? Is this a logical process, or is this an illogical process? Is it an illogical process, or what is it exactly?
What is revelation? The revelatory mechanism.
Yeah, yeah. So is it going to be a logical process, a logical process, or illogical process?
I'm not sure what you're asking. How you're telling me how is revelation a process? You're
So
saying
yeah, so like if I've got this being is giving me something, like, right, there's this divine being, and he's giving me the ability to use rationality, right? Um, Presumably, I'm going to be rationally understanding this. I'm not going to be rationally understanding this. One of those two is going to be the case, right? So I'm asking you, which of those two things is the case?
it's a rational process, but it's a rational process, but it's not logic justifying itself. It's
Well, like I said, any reason you put in there to believe in logic is going to be itself either reasonable or unreasonable, right? If the reason to believe something is itself reason giving to believe that thing, you're going to be using the process of reason for that, right? So this is sort of inescapable that
yeah,
this
that doesn't mean it's
anything you put
justifying.
in there is going to be circular. Now, I think
Again, that
um,
doesn't mean it's justifying itself. I gave you a perfect example. If I say I'm right because I'm right, it is different than me, being right and showing you how I'm right in the process. Yeah, I don't know. It's I don't know. You're going too deep into it, and it's difficult for me to use formal philosophy to counter argue. But I don't think what you're saying is equivalent to what you're. Sorry, I don't think what I'm saying is equivalent to what you're saying. I don't think it's circular in that sense.
well, it's definitely circular. It's just a matter of like, I mean, if you're just saying yeah, circularity is fine, cool. But if you have a distinguishing feature, like what is the distinguishing feature between the topologies of circularity that are okay and
If I tell you I don't mind circularity, you will behave as though I said I don't mind someone saying this is true because I said so. That's not the circularity I'm talking about. There's certainly different types of circularity. I can imagine this in my head very easily. Uh, it's not. It's too heavy for me to go deep into. So we can just stop here. Basically, we can argue about something else. If that's the point you want to, pivot around.
well, now the point I'm making is that if you don't know what the distinguishing feature of the types of circularity that you are okay with and the ones you aren't okay with, then how do you ever distinguish the ones that you are okay with and not? Like, if you're just
It's
going to
not.
say, hey, I'm okay with circularity of this kind, where God is reason giving to believe in the laws of logic, and then I say, okay, cool, well, I can put basically anything in there, and it's still going to have the same type of circularity, like universe forming unicorns, for instance, would have the
Of
same
course.
kind of circularity as reason giving to believe in the laws of
So,
logic.
so give me an equivalent example that would, you know, give some kind of, give me some reasons to believe in logic, to know, to believe that I can know logic, and to know, sorry, and to believe that I can use logic. Give me an example.
There are brain pixies that allow us to use logic, right? And they're reason giving for us to believe that we can use logic. It's the powers
So
of the
what
brain.
did so what did these brain pixies tell you?
They just give me the ability to use reason and logic. That's all they do.
Okay, what is that?
What do you mean? What is that? It's just the ability to use reason and logic. Is this? I mean, is this objectionable in some way, or do you like? Because it's obviously circular. Like I'm using the same thing. I'm using rationality. Like some fact one gives me the reason to believe in the conclusion. That is like rationality is something I can do and I can use. But presumably the very nature of reason givingness, like just it being reason giving to believe that conclusion, is going to use the thing in question, right? Like the thing in question is reason itself. We're asking about how do we justify these inferential
Well, I'm telling you,
relationships.
give me an example of a worldview that can do the same, basically. So, and I will happily accept it.
Well, it's
You're
not
telling me so.
a
Or we have an actual document, and the church that interprets this document and comes up with a worldview. And when we sit in that worldview explains to us why logic, exists, how we can know it, and so on and so on and so on. I don't see how the pixies do this. You can give me an alternative to show me, oh, it's anyone can do this. So give me a proper alternative. The
Yeah,
pixies.
so I'm not sure you're understanding the objection. The objection isn't that, oh, here's another worldview that can do this. I'm objecting saying your worldview in principle can't do this. I don't think it can be done because the very act of explain. Do you
You're
understand why?
applying,
Like circularity is objectionable because it's
you're
not
applying
explanatory, right? So like what you just said
you're
was
applying,
that. Just a second.
you're
So like
applying an external standard.
just a second. So what you said was that God is explaining how we can use reason, right? The problem is that if it's circular, it's by its nature non-explanatory. That's why circularity is objectionable. So if I can point out, hey, look, you have this thing that's supposedly reason giving to believe your conclusion, that we can use logic and reason, right? But the very nature of the thing you're giving, it's the reason givingness is being used. But that's the thing in question. So this is
Okay,
this is
so
a non-explanatory answer because it's circular. That's why it's objectionable.
if I look down a microscope and there's a piece of paper that says you're looking down a microscope, and I know I can trust this piece of paper for some reason because I know my brother put it there or something like this. Are you saying that's circular? I can't trust it because I'm using the microscope to know the microscope.
And I don't think that's even analogous, right? Like that's not an argument, right? Like it's just
Okay,
the
so
the instantiation of a sentence, like you're looking down a microscope, and the fact that you're looking down a microscope. There's nothing that's problematic there, right? What's the problem is you have a fact, right, that you're pointing to, saying, oh look, here's the fact. God is giving us reason to believe it, and then you have another fact. That fact is the reason givingness, that the nature, the relationship of the fact, the reason givingness to believe in reason. It's like, well, there's not a this is the weird sort of like false equivalences that Christians do. Like I heard one that was like, oh, so you think that I can't use my eyeballs to justify my eyesight? It's like, well, what? No, that's not the.
I have no clue what your objection is. So I'm going to ask you again. Can you come up with an alternative, worldview? Like, so far, this is just an external critique. You're saying this doesn't make sense. So
Wait,
use
do you
that.
think that contradictions are okay?
Okay, well, you give me an example where such a contradiction exists that has this using the same standard come up with a worldview that has the same contradiction.
Well, no, I'll just point out you're the contradiction you're making. So the
But
contradiction you're making is you made the claim that your worldview is explaining where
yeah,
where
you're
reason and logic is coming from. Now
you're telling
the
me what
problem
explaining.
is that
You're
if you
telling me what.
let's
One
not
sec, one sec.
each other if we could. So I'll let you go and then we'll go. What do you have to say? What was it?
You're telling me what explaining is. Then you're telling me your
Yeah. So
worldview.
sure.
You
So
don't
the
understand.
objection I'm levying is you have some fact. Premise one, that God exists. Premise two, God provides revelation, and the revelation is going to be reason giving to believe in logic. Therefore, I have reason to believe in logic. Something to that effect. I mean, that's a shoddy sort of
Yeah,
argument. But that's the
just to correct
general.
quickly. One second. I know God exists because it has been revealed. I don't presume God's existence, and then
Okay, so God's existence has been revealed. Premise one, you can replace whatever premise you prefer with that one, and then the conclusion of it though is I have reason to believe in logic. The problem here is that reason givingness, the very nature of the relationship between these premises you're providing, the reason givingness is the thing we're asking why you believe, right? But you're using the thing that's in question when you provide any kind of argumentation. It's going to be like componential to providing an argument that you have the reason givingness. So there's going to be this circularity. Now, the reason circularity is objectionable is because it's non-explanatory. But you claim that your worldview explains where reason and logic comes from. But if the answer is non-explanatory, then you have both explained and not explained. That's the contradiction I was pointing to.
okay. So you're making a contradiction by injecting your external standard. So you're telling me what explanation is based on your definition, You're telling me because that's what explanation is, and you're claiming to explain something, but you're not. So
Okay.
it's
What does
logical.
it mean to explain something then? Maybe I'm not understanding you. What does it mean to be something to be explained?
I'm too tired, and I don't want to, and I don't understand these deep philosophical terms. You can debate someone, more well versed if you want to get bogged down on that point. We can move on to something else, or we can end it here. It's your choice.
I mean, if you just don't if you don't know, then how can I be like misrepresenting you if you don't even know?
About the news,
You
you're
claimed
using.
that this explained it, but then you're saying you don't even know what it means for something to be explained. Like what?
No, I can. Like I said, I don't want to go deeper into this. It's not. I don't know what it means for something to be explained. I've already given you multiple examples about types of circularity I would be happy with, and types of circularity that I would not. For example, a book saying I'm right because I'm right, I would not be happy with this. But using a microscope, to see information about the microscope, that would tell me that I am using this type of microscope. That's a circularity that I would accept. And
Well, what's the
it's
distinguishing feature though? Like what are the distinguishing features of the types of circularity that you accept and the type that
not,
you reject?
it's too deep for me. I don't have that philosophical mind. You can debate this with someone else. You can move on to
So you
something else
don't
if
know
you
what
like.
explain means. You don't know the kind of circularity you're okay with. So how do you even, I mean, like these are going to be confidential to your worldview for it to even work, right? Like you're going to need to know those things before you can know your worldview even works. Because if I were to give you some sort of comparable kind of worldview, right, you wouldn't even know whether or not it was using the same type of circularity that you're using because you don't even know what the distinguishing feature of the type of circularity you accept is. How do you
I can
do a
sit
worldview
down.
analysis without even knowing your own
I've had
view?
a long day, and like I sleep in like 30 minutes. I can sit down one day and write the distinguishing uh, differences between this type of circularity and this one. But for now, I'm gonna have to tell you that I'm done. With this conversation, we can talk about something else.
Okay, well, what else did you want to talk about exactly?
Um,
Thought we were.
I've had this discussion with this guy about the is or problem, and he was so. Do you believe that you can have ethics? That there
No,
is
do I think
more
that,
morality?
yeah. I think morality is real. Yeah, and I actually hold to kind of a strong position on this. I think that the only way you can have moral realism is if God doesn't exist. I think that's the only way you can have it. I think
Well,
any
tell me
kind of deity entails an anti-realist notion of morality.
how. So, do you know the is or problem?
Yeah. The Izot gap. We can't derive normativity from. Uh, we cannot derive normative
So go ahead
statements
and tell me
from
how.
entirely
Yes.
descriptive.
I don't, just tell me how. How do you do it? How do you get an oath from is?
Well, that presumes that I think I do that, right? Like I'm a non-naturalist, so I wouldn't hold to that position.
So, what do you mean? Do you believe? I mean, what do you believe about? Tell me, what do you believe about morality?
So non-naturalism, basically, it's a type of like non-reductivism. So, um, you can think of it like there's a discontinuity between normative statements and is statements, right? But there's going to be a fixing relationship between is statements and normative statements. That is to say that any given world that has identical natural facts, so the is statements, is going to have the same identical normative facts, the ought statements. There's not going to be some sort of derivation though. So what's not happening is we're not going um, is like there's reductive naturalism, the idea that you can literally derive like happiness is what it means to be good, right? I'm going to reject this position because I can offer some reductio ad absurdum to it, right? So for instance, if I hooked everybody up to a happiness machine, it's not going to produce the best possible world, so happiness isn't equal to goodness. um, in any kind of sort of like reductive naturalism, I'm going to reject. And then non-reductive naturalism is very similar to non-naturalism. The distinguishing feature is how we know moral facts. So the way in which we know moral facts from a naturalist position is going to be a posteriori, and the way from a non-naturalist position is a priori. So we know them in virtue of like meaning, not in virtue of like discovery. So that's the distinguishing feature between naturalism and non-naturalism. Now, the type of objection that the is-ought gap is an objection to reductive sense of naturalism. So, like a non-naturalist position doesn't have to hold to the same sort of conditions, and neither does a non-reductive naturalism. So, like a non-reductive naturalist is just going to say that the is-ought distinction is going to be like a semantic distinction. Like, there's not some sort of reduction from non-natural facts, from like normative facts to these natural facts, in the same way that the reductivist is going to hold to. But the is-ought gap only applies to reductive naturalism. It's not something that goes for everybody.
Like I don't. Sorry, I'm pretty sure I've kept up with all of this, but I haven't heard how you get, ethics. Like, tell me something you think is ethical, and tell me how you got to that.
Something I think is ethical. I thought you were asking about my meta ethics, not my applied ethics. So, like at applied
Yeah,
ethics level,
no,
like
we'll get there. So let's ask you about something you think is ethical, and then I'll ask you about your meta ethics, how you determine that be ethical.
your meta ethics don't determine your applied ethics. That's not how that works. So, like for instance, if I say, oh, it's good to feed the poor, or help the poor survive, or something like that, right? Like I think this isn't going to be something that you derive from your meta ethics. Like there's not a way to derive your normative ethics from your meta ethics. You're just going to be like, I'm an intuitionist at the epistemic level, so that's how I know moral facts. Like I think that we know them through our intuitions, but there's not going to be some kind of derivation that's just not how that works.
Do you think whatever is intuitive to a human being is good?
No. So that the way in which we know them is via our intuitions, but there's going to be times where we're wrong about them, right? And so what we do to adjudicate those kind of differences is what's called intuition pumps. Intuition pumps are basically like think of them like hypotheticals where we sort of remove a number of the problematic portions that might be clouding our judgment. Like if we gave, as an example, um, the the analogy of the famous violinist from Thompson is a very famous intuition pump about abortion, as just a simple example. Now, she doesn't argue that abortion is good. She argues that it's not evil. And so that's how we sort of go about the adjudication process. So we're going to disagree with our intuitions at times, but we have an adjudication method.
Yeah, but how do you know that your intuition maps onto ethical, uh, something called ethics?
Well, that's just part of what it means for like the intuition to happen, right? So like to have a moral intuition is for it to map onto ethics in some way. I can be wrong about it, like same as I can be wrong about a scientific fact. Like I can even investigate things by proper scientific methodology, and still sometimes we'll get it
When
wrong.
you say maps, so you're saying, so what is ethics?
So what is ethics? Ethics is like the field of study of of what we ought or ought not do.
Then is it a real category or is it just a convention?
Yeah, no, like I said, I'm a realist in a robust sense, but I don't think that you can be as a Christian. I don't think anyone who has like a God of any
Yeah,
kind can be a robust realist.
forget me for a second.
What is it?
I said forget me and my worldview for a second. I'm just trying to understand. So you do believe ethics are a real category, right? What you
Yeah,
said.
yeah. So I'm going to affirm all three of the theses of robust realism.
How do you know our intuition maps onto this category?
Well, so from the intuitionist perspective, it's not like we sit there and go, do our intuitions map onto this? What we do instead is what we're talking about is our intuitions, like right. That's just what we're doing when we're talking about like applied ethics. And then meta ethics is a discussion of, well, where are those intuitions coming from? What are these like facts that we're perceiving? So like an intuition is just means an apprehension of a fact without some inferential methodology. So uh, you might intuit in some given instance that I ought not do X, right? What you didn't do from the non-naturalist perspective is you didn't go, you know what, I'm going to take all these facts and I'm going to, derive this ought from these ises. That's just not what you're doing. That's not how you know normative
Like
fact.
you're just assuming reality. Uh, behaves according to the definition of a word we made up. Like, how do you know humans as an organism can intuit?
Well, what do you mean? How I know an organism can intuit and doing it?
How do you know humans can intuit in the first place? Like, you're telling me intuition means this, so when we have an intuition, we do that. How do we know we have intuition in the first place? Like, you're just applying a definition of a word we defined to humans without explaining how or why you think humans have this thing called intuition. Like,
So,
how do you sorry, one sec. How do you know humans apprehend facts, specifically about ethics, ethical
so,
realities?
so intuitionism is a little deeper of a topic. It's not just with respect to like morality and things like that, right? So, like, intuitionism is the idea that that's how we apprehend facts at all, right? Like the number one way what we do. There's a there's a system called phenomenal conservatism, which is my personal favorite position right now. It's kind of newer in the literature. Essentially, the idea is that we don't do is we don't like have some other set of reasons that justify intuitions. That's just nonsensical, right? Instead, what we have is we have intuitions, and then we have what are called defeaters. So we have some kind of seemings of the world, the way things seem to be as far as we can tell, and then we look for defeaters. So the way in which we know any fact at all, is going to be starting with those seemings. And intuitions are a topology of those seemings. So, like, for instance, when I'm intuiting a moral fact, that's just the way things seem to be. I'm starting with the seemings. And so then the next step is to test those seemings against what's called defeaters. So defeater is like an opposite reason, a reason to not believe in the thing that is the seeming. So if I'm having this experience, like, and I think that my experiences are veridical, then I'm just going to kind of base it on that experience. Now, without some kind of like defeater, I'm prima facie justified in believing that seeming. So whenever I'm intuiting a
Yeah.
fact that's like a moral fact of some kind, I'm prima
Okay, so
facie justified in that until I find a defeater. And I don't think there is a defeater for like moral realism.
okay, so when you intuit, quotation marks, to put it more bluntly, there is an experience. I'm not even going to say you have an experience. I'm just going to say there is an experience, sensation, an experience, say whatever. And then when you feel that something is a defeater, is just another experience. So how do you know this experience involves a person who is having something called an intuition? This intuition maps onto reality, and then using another experience, he can cancel out biases and whatever to fine tune. I mean, it looks like you've taken 10 steps, that you haven't really justified.
No, they are justified. That's the whole point of the argument. Is the argument is essentially that the seemings are prima facie justified, right? Because it's going to be like you're going to have only a handful of options to you. Either you're going to base things on the way things seem to be, you're going to not base them on the way it seems to be, right? Those are the two options you've got. There's a few different ways you could do that, but all the ways not basing it on the way things seem to be are going to end up being just completely weird and just irrational, right? So, like, you start with the seemings. The world seems to be this way. I seem to be having this experience. I seem to have an I-ness to it. It seems this way to me. It seems that way to me. And then what we do is we look for defeaters for that. So, for instance, let's say someone says, "It seems to me that there is a God." I have this sort of, I don't know, like an intuition that there is this deity that's sort of propping everything up. And then we look for defeaters for that seemings, right? So, say, for instance, the problem of evil. Well, that'd be reason giving not to believe in like an all good God. Or let's say, for instance, it seems to me the world is flat. Like when I look out my window, it seems to be the case. I don't see a curve to the planet. I just see this flat, it looks like just a flat plane in front of me. Well, then we look for other seemings that are going to, give us reason to think, okay, well, here's a defeater for that. Well, I've got pictures from the International Space Station. We've flown into space.
You
We've looked at the
you,
Earth
you
and
get,
it looks round. We have mathematical proofs for why the world is not flat. So
yeah,
that's what we
one
do.
second.
Is go ahead.
So you gave a few examples of things that are not that don't regard ethics, but even with this, you still haven't justified how this experience you have is maps onto reality. But
Yeah,
even
this
if you do, even if we skip that step, you still haven't. So you've given me an example of disproving things using logic and disproving things using empirical observation. I don't see how you could find a defeater for moral things, because it's the only thing that could justify, from what I've heard from you, is the only thing that could, conjure up morality is intuition. So there isn't,
I don't.
you can't use logic or empirical findings to disprove this ethical system over this one. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I don't think there is a defeater for morality. That's the whole point. If there was a defeater for it, then I wouldn't believe in it. Right? That's the whole point.
So your example with God and with flat Earth have nothing to do with this, basically. I don't see why you've given them. Okay.
So it was examples of how my technology works, because you're asking me how I know things. So, like, for instance, how do I know X, Y, or Z that, like morality maps onto the world, those kinds of things? Then I'm giving you sort of the more fundamental answer to that. The answer is I base things on my seemings, and then from there I look for defeaters. If they're not defeaters, then I'm prima facie justified in believing the seemings, and so I'm prima facie justified in believing the seemings.
I'm good. I'm not gonna go over the metaphysics and empirical and whatever. Let's just stick to ethics. You don't believe there are defeaters for ethics, so it's entirely based on each person's intuition, which you're saying could be wrong. Like
Well, no,
people
that's
can
not what I said. What I said is there's not. What I said is there's not a defeater for ethics being real, and then I said that we do have methods of adjudication. So you and I can be wrong about those things, and we have methods for adjudication when that happens. Those things are called intuition pumps.
Give me an example.
So, for instance, if you and I have a difference of intuition on, the facts around, like, abortion, that was one of the examples I gave. So Judith Jarvis Thompson gives an argument called the analogy of the famous violinist. This is an intuition pump that helps us adjudicate our discrepancies about our intuitions on the topic.
Could you give me an example?
That was the example.
Like, if I think abortion is good, you think it's bad. How are we? Where are the defeaters that would, change my mind or yours? The right answer.
Have you? I don't know if you maybe just haven't engaged with. It basically, it's an analogy of the famous violinist. What she does is she starts off by sort of steel manning the opponent's position. She gives the reasons that somebody is usually like anti-abortion are usually something about like the personhood of the fetus, those sorts of things. Judith grants all these very, otherwise strong positions to the opponent. Says, okay, let's grant that it's a person for a second. Now, imagine you wake up in a hospital and you're attached to this person. Now, this person is unconscious and they are a famous violinist. The whole world wants this person to survive. And the doctor comes in and says, "Oh, good, you're awake." So we searched all of the available people on the entire planet, of everyone. There's only one human being who could sustain this person. You have to remain attached to him for 9 months. And after 9 months, he'll be able to go back to playing his violin. He's a world famous violinist, and everyone wants him to survive. And the question is, are you obligated to remain attached to this person? Overall, the answer is mostly no, despite the fact that the majority, like during this conversation, there's a much more even split between people who are pro-choice and those who are pro-life, or at least at the time of writing it, there were. So this is a way of adjudicating the facts of the conversation by removing some of the discrepancies, right? So like the whole point is that.
Okay, but do you not see how a lot of that had, implied implicit ethics in it? So like when he's a famous violin, we don't know whether that's good or bad. So you're using, you're baking into it ethics to come up with an ethical, I don't know if you see, what you're doing. I mean, you're telling me the story of okay, is it good to abort this baby? And then we look at all the things surrounding it. Let's assume he's a person. Well, even if he is a person, is it good to kill a person or not? We don't know that either. We don't know anything. All these things are determined by our intuition. So none of these things are set in the first place. So how do you set the first ethical standard?
Well, first off, the word "determined" is wrong. Because you didn't ask me how do we determine the things that are good or bad. We're
Intuit,
asking
whatever.
how do we know them, right? So the way in which we know them is via our intuition. So when we're talking about this topic, we're just talking about our. I thought we were just talking about the intuitions, like how do we adjudicate if we have differences
Yeah,
in
but
intuitions.
when I asked you, like, what is an example of a defeater, you gave me a story that had implicit ethics within it. You know, about the baby, whether he's going to be a famous violinist or not. This doesn't matter. This is not.
I thought you were asking for an example of an intuition pump, not a defeater. Like the examples of the
For
defeaters that I gave.
for example, you know, in my worldview, I would tell you straight up, okay, because of how God is and what He has told us and so on, I believe that a baby is a person. So if someone says, let's kill a baby, that's murder. So that's bad. So that would be a defeater because you're breaking that law. So what is a defeater for you? So give me an example of it, a clear example of a defeater that you could use.
That's not even what. That's not even what defeat. So what a defeater means is like a defeater is some kind of a something that would derive a contradiction between the way the things seem to be and the way things like actually are, right? So like a defeater for flat Earth. So even though I look out my window and it seems to me that the Earth
for ethics, in
you're
regards
just.
to ethics.
If I thought there was a defeater for ethics, I wouldn't believe in ethics. That's not. That's. I don't know if you
No,
understand what a defeater is.
bro, like I literally asked you, you know, between abortion is good and abortion is bad, how, you know, what could determine which one is good, which one is the true one?
Yeah, that's not a defeat. It's called an intuition pump. The way in which we adjudicate differences of intuitions are called intuition pumps. The example of the intuition pump was the one I gave, which is Judith Jarvis Thompson's paper on basically it was in defense of abortion, and she was saying that basically we're just
It
wrong
doesn't
about
matter.
things when we think that it's always wrong to end the life of a person. That's just not always the case.
Yeah, but why?
Well, so what she does is she provides an analogy, right? The analogy of the famous violinist that I just sort of outlined for you. The
Yeah, but
majority of people are going
this
to,
analogy, before you repeat the analogy, this analogy has loads of ethics implicitly baked into it.
well, yeah, because we're talking about applied ethics, right? Like once you start asking about like ethical things, like what's right or wrong, we're talking about applied ethics.
But
Applied
you
ethics.
haven't shown,
Just a
you
second.
haven't shown.
Just a second. Just a second. Applied ethics always assumes ethics. The moment you start performing applied ethics, it's always
No,
assumed.
that's not what I meant.
So what
I
do you
meant
mean?
this story. No, I'm not saying this story assumes ethics. I'm saying this story assumes normative ethical standards. Like, okay, the famous violinist, you know, this is good to keep him or bad to keep. You know, it's assuming these things. We haven't established these things yet.
So are you at? So you want to talk about my meta ethics, or do you want to talk about my applied ethics? Because I thought you were asking about my applied ethics.
Well, I'm going from there to there.
Yeah,
I'm
you
asking you.
don't. That's not how that works. Like when some people think that like you're going to derive your applied ethics from your meta ethics. That's not what you do. You don't start with your applied ethics and then derive your meta.
Sorry,
Or
yeah.
like unapply with your meta. You don't start with your meta ethics and then talk about your applied ethics. So for instance, like
It was two
you
separate questions.
and just a second, me, you, and a subjectivist, someone who's just like believes that ethical truths are only true in virtue of the person, right? There's nothing like robust about it. We could agree at every level of applied ethics. We could just agree on the methodology. We could all agree on everything from whether or not we should have abortion or not. And I could be a robust realist going like, oh yeah, no, it's actually really true. There's something that's stance independent making this true. And they could be like, no, it's just about our preferences, right? There's nothing derivative of one from the other. There's that's just not a relationship that they have.
No, that's not what it was two separate questions. The first question was, there is an experience. Where where do you get that this experience is intuition? That was the
Where do I
first
get
question.
the
That was the first question in regards to meta ethics. And then the second question in regards to normative ethics, if you're saying ethics is intuitively discovered or whatever, how do we know that my intuition is wrong or your intuition is right? Or you know, if that's the only, so in terms of, let's say, logic or like truth or falsehood, I can have an intuition and then we can check it using a different system, using logic, using reason. With science, I can have an intuition and then we can check it with empirical facts. With ethics, you're saying the only way we can discover ethics is through intuition. So what are we checking ethics with afterwards to determine who has the right ethical standard?
That's presuming that there is you're presuming something that I think is just demonstrably false, right? Like what you can't do is you can't take this and put it into, say, for instance, the syllogistic methodology, right? Because, like you said, the Izod gap, you can't derive normative statements from descriptive statements. So the normative statements are going to be assumed in the premises in order to have a normative statement in the conclusion. So you can't check it like that. The only tool that you have, literally the only one, is your intuition on the topic. It's not that you check it against another tool. You check it against the same tool. Now, sometimes our intuitions get it wrong, and so the way in which we adjudicate those errors is by providing intuition pumps. So when, say, for instance, your intuition messes up, sometimes it's not perfect. It's not like we just see the world and we get it right every single time. We know that that's
Address
just
the first question. Sorry to cut you. We've repeated this answer 3 times. Can you address the first question as to how do you label an experience, intuition? How do you get that label?
So in intuition, it's difficult to go over, I guess, like how exactly we form these, because I don't think that there's like a solid answer to it. It's just something that happens to us. We have them whether we want to or not. But I
An
don't think it's
experience.
like something where we have something like that it's derivative of, right? So, for
You have
instance,
an
when
experience.
you're asking for like some sort of something epistemically prior to an intuition, there's just not something there. That's the base of it.
Intuition is a assumption laden word, filled with assumptions and extra steps you've taken. Like I said, the most you can say is that there is an experience. You can't even say I have an experience. You can say there is an experience.
Oh, I can
Maybe you
say
can
I can say I have.
maybe,
Absolutely.
maybe
Like
you can say that. Fine,
you're
fine.
making all these like statements that are just false, right? Like you're telling me I can or can't do something. How do you
Fine,
derive
fine.
it? How are you getting to I can't do
It's
that?
whether you can or can't. I'm asking how. So
Well, how
okay,
are you getting to I can't do that? Where are you getting that from? Because you said it a
okay,
couple of times now. How are you getting that?
okay. Can and show me how.
Well,
You're telling
no.
me
I'm asking. You said I
experience.
can't, not whether or not I
I
could.
changed
I
my
gave
mind. I'm sorry.
I,
I
I
changed my
gave you an
mind.
answer of how I
I
can.
don't think you can, but if you can, show me how.
Well,
It's
I
not
already
that you
know I
can't.
did, right? So I start with the seemings. The seemings are the way things are. It seems to be the case that I am here. It seems to be the case that I am an I. It seems to be the case that I'm having these vertical experiences. But you're assuming that I need to start somewhere prior to that, and you're saying I
So
can't do that. You're
you're
saying
just
I
saying
can't.
that's
You're saying I can't make the move I just made. So I'm asking you, how are you getting to that sort of a
I'm not saying you can't. You're just saying, okay, this seems to be this way, so it is this way.
yeah?
I'm just gonna
That's
assume it's this way.
Well, no, it's not. I assume it to be this way. It seems to be this way. Now, I could be wrong about that. So what I do then is I look for defeaters. I try to find ways to defeat my seemings. So the next move I'm going to make is I'm going to go, okay, well, it seems
You
to
can't.
me intuitively that the world is flat. Well, let's look for defeaters for the fact that the world seems flat. Well, here's a great defeater
Okay,
for it. Right?
it seems to you that you exist, but how can you, if that's one of the most essential assumptions you have, how can you find the
Well, it's not an
defeater?
assumption. You're just throwing in words there, right? Like I told you.
Whatever. Okay, so when you assume sorry, when something seems to be a certain way to you and you move on from that, how can you then go backwards?
Well,
Why is
by
the falsification? What is the falsification for these things that seem to be this way? What kind of defeaters would show you that it's not this way?
Well, I gave you
Like what?
specific examples. I don't know if you
Let me
listened.
sorry. Let me ask you a specific question. What? So it seems to you that that this experience is called intuition, which means that it has these extra beliefs bootstrapped to it. What would be the falsification for this? Like, what kind of defeater would you need to find?
So, like, I don't think that there is a defeater, but like, I don't even know how to give an example of a defeater if there's not one, right? So, if we somehow discovered something that told us that it was in fact not the case that there are any normative facts whatsoever, that would be a defeater, right? Like, if we had good reason to think that normative facts don't exist or can't exist or something like that, that's what it takes to be a defeater, is to give us reasons to think that.
All right. Well, it was good talking to you, but I have to go now. And like I said, if you want to have a more rigorous philosophical discussion, probably you should talk to. I mean, I don't know if you've already had talks with these people or if you want to have talks with them, but someone who has, some background in philosophy. I don't know if Marco wanted to.
Yeah, feel free. Then send them
No,
the
I can't
parlay.
invite them because, first of all, I'm banned from the Jedi server, and these are not like my lap dogs or anything like that. I'm just doing this. I don't own them. So if you want to debate them, you have to go seek them out yourself. But
Hey,
I did ping a mod from the Jedi server and told him that you Marco wanted to talk to them. That's the most I can do.
or do you think like a meta justification critique, is that like a category or?
It can be. So, for instance, so like one of the examples that I give of like meta justifications that I'm going to reject is going to be any sort of meta justification for something like logic or inferential relationships or any of that. So, and my reasoning goes like this: like, it's either going to be the case that the thing that's supposedly giving you reason to believe in logic is going to be itself reasonable, or it's going to be not reasonable, meaning it's going to be like irrational or irrational. I don't think that irrational things or irrational things can be reason giving. So it's going to be something that's reason giving. But if we're like giving reasons for logic, we're going to be utilizing the thing in question, right? Which is like some sort of inferential relationships. And then that's going to be using, some type of logic, whether it's going to be classical Aristotelian, paraconsistent or dialectic. It's going to be using one of those kinds of something of that effect to derive that as a conclusion. So if your conclusion is going to be something about like logic or anything like that, you're just making a category error. That's why I think it ends up being circular. So I'm sort of like, you can think of it like quietism if you're familiar with it. So quietism is like the position that some meta levels just basically don't exist. Like a quietist about ethics is going to say that meta ethics doesn't exist. A quietist about like meta justifications for certain things, like this is one of the ones that I'm a quietist about. I just think that the questions don't even make sense. Like, how do you justify logic? The question is just nonsensical.
Like, you can't have a justification outside of the system.
Exactly. It doesn't make any sense.
I don't know. I don't know if you can like logically justify logic, right? But I'm sure we can posit models of how we've come to logic and how we can like understand how we got to logic, right? Not that it's such like so related, but I mean,
You mean something like if we're trying to have like the propositions be derivative of things in the world, we can sort of like posit this model of logic that seems to
no, more like here
things.
we have the world is structured according to logic, and we evolved to fit the world. Therefore, it makes sense that we got to logic epistemologically or evolutionarily, whatever you want, because that's what governs the world. Now, of course, I cannot justify that's what governs the world or whatnot, but I mean, I give a model that explains how we came to logic, not justifying that it's correct. Well, I mean, it would be correct because it's fitting the world in that model, but you know what I'm saying? It's just like here's a model that we cannot test, but makes a lot of sense. For example, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I get where you're coming from. I guess just my way of thinking about the topic is just that there's it's more so that there's something broken with the question, not that there's a right answer. I think the question is wrong. Is the objection. So like you providing like it's not that I think that you don't have any reasons to believe in something, like for instance why you accept the Aristotelian laws of logic versus like a paraconsistent logic, right? You might have some set of reasons why you'd believe one is right or the other. Like, for instance, one maps onto the world, but you're just kind of using the rational things that you're questioning if you ever try to justify them in some meaningful sense outside of themselves. And I think that that's just it's baked into the question is the problem. So, like, if you bake circularity into a question and then you're surprised that it spits out a circular answer, yeah, that's just that's how that works. When you ask for circularity, you get circularity. So, like, how do you justify the laws of logic? It's like you're asking for circularity, and then you're surprised that circularity comes out the other side. It's like if you ask me to bake a cake and I bake a cake, are you gonna get mad about it, bro? Like,
yeah, it's where it's like almost like asking, well, describe English to me without using, or describe languages to me without using languages. Like,
It's like describe language for me.
Yeah, communicate without communicating. Do that.
Yeah,
Or communicate what communicating is without communicating ever. I go, oh, what? Without using communication. What? I cannot do that. Kind of. But I mean, it's weird. Like when you investigate what we cannot do, you could derive some useful information for that. Like, I mean, look at the most basic example. No, the information we will derive it would be basic. But if we know that we cannot justify logic, logic on its own is just how to generate true conclusions from true premises, right? And if we cannot justify logic, that kind of implies that like the way to generate true conclusions from true premises is how you justify. Maybe that's like a conclusion we can have because we know we cannot justify logic. You're following me? It's kind of, I don't know, out there.
And it might have helped if I had used just that very simplistic definition you used there, like even in this discussion, because I think one of the problems why he might not have been seeing the circularity is I didn't define logic in like that.
I wasn't in the Presup section. I don't know. I wasn't.
Oh, well, he seemed to be confused about like why I was pointing out that his explanation that God somehow like reveals logic or reason to us is begging the question. Like it's it can't be the case that that's happening for a number of reasons. And I noticed he was very, I'm quick to throw out a little bit of bait. Like I throw out the bait of like, that I take a very strong position that if you believe in a God, then you can't believe morality is real. I thought for sure he'd like that one. He was a pretend Presup, but I don't think he's at all because he didn't seem to like. Once we got down to circularity and objections to circularity, he didn't know the distinctions. He didn't even know like the terms like vicious and virtuous. And then he all he seemed to want to do is just he wanted to flip the tables, and I was like, well, this isn't going to tell me anything about what's true or not. And he also seemed to kind of like whenever he got into a spot where he was, I think he saw the next move was kind of the checkmate. He'd go, well, I'm not really an expert on this, and so I just suggest you talk to someone else because I don't know the deep philosophical terminology. I was like, dude, this is like layman shit.
I'm gonna use that as well. Whenever I like get in trouble, I'm like, well, talk to Tart about it. I don't care.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Just throw them to me.
Wait, give me a second.
I'm gonna do the same thing every time I get cornered. Okay, well, I'm not an expert on that. Talk to sample text.
Like, right. About what am I an expert on? Like data science, maybe. Yeah. Talk about AI. I'll be there. But
it's gonna be my new game. I'm gonna do that.
Is there anything? Are there any good resources about the companions in guilt? Because I don't know. It seems weird. But
the Rescuing the Companions in Guilt article. I'm trying to think who it's by. Was it decent?
Yeah, there was a Cowie or whatever that criticized.
Yeah, you're right. That's it.
Haven't read either the original, like the Moral Net Web, I think that's the name of it, or I haven't read the critique, and I'm not, so it's like you start from the end. You start the response to the argument. But maybe.
Yeah, I think some of the lowball like responses are, at least in my opinion, they're fairly weak. Like it's like something to the effect of, well, I could just accept epistemic norms and then reject, other types of norms, like maybe like the norms or something like. And it's like, yeah, sure, there might be a difference, but the thing that the Companions in Guilt is objecting to is
there seems to be a difference about like physical action norms and like epistemic belief norms. But it does grant that like some norms exist. I mean, he was successful in that. But I mean, it's only because we are accepted as a premise that epistemic norms exist. I mean, if someone's going to challenge anything, it's going to be probably that the moral norms exist or epistemic norms exist. But I don't know. I'll have to read more about it. But I mean, I still like my joke about like Fleur sent like a couple papers trying to justify like objective ethics with it. So I have the taste like objection, so I'm just gonna call it Companions in Innocence.
Companions in Innocence. He's trying to justify
which is interesting. I like that, but
Companions in Innocence. Like I said, my one the barrier that holds me back from being like a realist about like aesthetics or something is going to be that then it becomes very difficult, I think, to sort of differentiate what we mean by. Yeah, so aesthetics being like stance independent, I think there's some problems with like, because then when we start getting down to like how do we differentiate, like what does it mean for like something to be like a subjective idea
Well, the
versus
thing is,
an
for
objective
Fleur, it's
idea?
like for Fleur when he the way I think the way I understand it, he would say like it could be stance independent but still subjective because it's just like it could vary from person to person. It's just not because of their stance on it, right? It could be that like they
Mhm.
feel different things or like it's up to their decision, but it's still subjective, right?
That's an interesting response. See, I
What?
think my question is more about that's a very interesting response. But my question is more about like the propositional relationship. Like I use the paradigmatic case of like I like ice cream. And this I take to be like a subjective thing. Like some people like ice cream, some people don't like ice cream. But this is going to be, I like ice cream is definitely going to be true or false depending on who says it and who whether or not you do like ice cream. Like it's going to be the